me. I'm presuming everyone can hear me loud and clear.
Yes.
Although I have a habit of shouting and I'm cold and this ear is blocked, and I feel the need to really speak loudly because I can't hear myself. So if I get too loud, tell me so. Okay. So if I may start off by thanking Emmanuel and Nick and the School of Global Health for inviting me, the keynote speaker, and generally for being part of this wonderful, excellent initiative. If I may say, it's such a pleasure and really and so emboldening to see the conversations on extreme heats, compounding extreme events, expanding across the globe. And moreover, really interesting, I was at the first few sessions yesterday to look at the data that's emerging on Europe on mortality and morbidity. And it stands interestingly in contrast with what we're seeing across South Asia. The numbers are not quite the same, but the impacts nevertheless are what they are palpable. So thank you for the opportunity to speak at this important gathering on extreme heat and health in the context of climate change. My perspective today emerges from several decades of work on urbanization. I am a city and regional planner, mobility, displacement, and climate vulnerability in Pakistan, where I have focused on large cities such as Karachi, and also in Africa, where I have focused my work on cities such as Nairobi, and have now moved on to secondary cities such as Jacobabad, for instance, in Pakistan. And let's see if this moves. Moving a bit slowly. Okay, so as we're crossing these new frontiers, heat frontiers, so right here, this is, I want to show you on the, I thought I knew how to turn on the little laser. So now, okay, no, that's not it. Sorry, Martin, how do we turn on that little laser again? Oh, that's simple, thank you. And right here, this is where my current work is focused, on that little red dot in the middle of Pakistan. And well, in the southern part of Pakistan, but north of the city of Karachi. And I will talk a little bit about Jacobabad also and this notion of the outer limits of adaptation. So as sort of moved on now to secondary cities, and I will also draw on my work that I'm involved that have been involved in a collaborative research project on mobility, heat stress, and undernutrition, and now on exploring the new frontiers of heat adaptation with various colleagues across the global north and south, and highly interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary teams. So this keynote draws on also on rich collaborative exchanges with my IID colleagues, and specifically their work on Africa, and I'd just like to give a quick shout out to them, and their work across African cities, particularly on community-led heat monitoring in Kenya, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, because the patterns that we observe in South Asia, in urban South Asia, resonate powerfully across the African continent. And in both regions, extreme heat manifests not only as an atmospheric condition, but as a deeply social and, most of all, infrastructural reality disproportionately borne by low-income urban residents, especially women. So the intersectionality dimension being a very important one. So we meet at a moment when global heat exposure is no longer an environmental event. It is becoming an all-encompassing condition, shaping bodies, behaviors, economies, and social possibilities. In places like Jacobabad, where summer temperatures already brush against physiological limits of human tolerance, we are witnessing the arrival of what certain climate scientists call life at the heat frontier. And here in this city, in Jacobabad, where ambient temperatures have crossed 51 Celsius, 52 Celsius, and that's just ambient readings, people are negotiating not simply high temperatures, but their approach to uncompensable heat, where thermoregulation fails and overheating becomes inevitable. So,
just because
can we close the laser?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. Slide. Thank you.
So Which slide?
So this is the one that I wanted currently, just to, I was going to talk about it for a few seconds.
This one.
Yeah, okay, and then I was going to shift.
Oh,
it
it's
over.
because the manual said it was not right. Okay.
Okay, all right, thank you. So this is the current project that I am working on, anticipating unseen climate events, with colleagues over at King's College London, Dr. Tom Matthews, who's a climate scientist. And this is a 3-year project that focuses specifically on Jacobabad. And Jacobabad, interestingly, is a city where the meteorological evidence is showing that as far as uncompensable heat is concerned, if this is sort of the conventional wisdom of what is the threshold of adaptation, human adaptation to extreme heat, Jacobabad for a 10-hour mean has already crossed that limit. The blue line being the uncompensable heat aspect, and the dots above it show that the sort of the heat temperatures, ambient temperatures, and especially the WBGT in Jacobabad have already been crossed. So we just implemented this project earlier this year, and it's a combination of both qualitative and quantitative mixed methods. And we're going to focus on Jacobabad and a few other cities around that region to think about what are the impacts of heat both from a climate science perspective and also from a social science perspective, where what is the lived experience of everyday lived experience of extreme heat across different neighborhoods with intersectionality in mind when it comes to these thresholds being crossed. And of course, with infrastructural failures as events, everyday events in people's lives. So yet these heat thresholds do not operate in isolation. Human vulnerability is never merely biophysical. It is biosocial, structured by infrastructures of water, shelter, energy, and mobility, by gender divisions of labor, and by political and economic inequities. Today, I want to share how the intersections of heat stress, undernutrition, and mobility could also reveal not only new forms of risk, but also new conceptual tools and policy pathways for equitable adaptation. Recent physiological research offers a stark clarification. Compensable heat is the range in which the human body can still regulate temperature through sweating and behavioral adjustments. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to figure out how to, I want to just come back here. Uncompensable heat describes conditions of often combinations of extreme temperature and humidity, where the body can no longer dissipate heat adequately, regardless of behavior. In Jacobabad, WBGTs have reached 33 to 34 Celsius and even beyond that, approaching the theoretical threshold for uncompensable heat. Many communities now live through prolonged periods where indoor temperatures may very well exceed outdoor readings, trapping households in heat that weather stations underestimate. These indoor dynamics are not unique to Pakistan. Participatory heat monitoring in informal settlements in Nairobi's Mathare, Dar es Salaam's Kombo, and Kariba in Zimbabwe shows indoor temperatures reaching 5 to 10 Celsius higher than recorded outdoors, with heat retained long into the night, precisely the period when households expect respite. So this is this little bit, tiny bit of sliver of data is part of a project that IID has been, colleagues at IID have been involved in for the last couple of years. And this report is going to be out around about the first quarter 2026. So please keep your eyes on it. I reviewed the report, and it's an absolutely fascinating, fantastic insight into what is actually happening across these cities vis-a-vis people's lived experiences of extreme heat inside their homes. So in African cities, just as in South Asian cities like Jacobabad, the distinction between outdoor and indoor exposure collapses for the urban poor. The home often becomes a heat trap. Physiology alone cannot explain vulnerability. The ability to thermoregulate them is deeply shaped by access to potable water, quality of shelter and ventilation, socially assigned labor patterns, health status, including nutritional reserves, mobility constraints, access to cooling or electricity. In fact, the evidence from African informal settlements corroborates this pattern. Housing made of thin corrugated metal, overcrowding, limited ventilation, and unsafe conditions that prevent residents, often women, from opening windows at night, all contribute to faster accumulation of indoor heat and the reduced ability to dissipate it. In Mathare, for example, 80% of residents reported feeling uncomfortable or very uncomfortable at home during high heat periods, with nighttime overheating disrupting sleep, worsening chronic conditions, and increasing stress. Thus, uncompensable heat is not just a biophysical limit, it is also a socially produced limit, reached sooner by those with fewer protections. But how hard are these limits to these biophysical thresholds, keeping in mind the biosocial side? So in Jacobabad, we're learning in terms of what helps to push the envelope within communities that could help assist with heat health, risk reduction, and adaptation efforts at the local level. And to gain a better understanding of life at the frontier and what is also likely to help understand where the outer limit of adaptation is under these different scenarios, with or without air conditioning. So just to give you a very quick synopsis of Jacobabad, I showed you Jacobabad on the map. Jacobabad is a secondary city in the northern part of Sindh. It's approximately a 7.5, 8-hour drive from Karachi, going upward to the northern part. And in our project, as I mentioned earlier, we're exploring the societal impacts of extreme heat, both currently and in the future of the city. It is considered, Jacobabad has become a poster child for one of the hottest cities on the planet, on the front line of extreme heat. And it is also a city, or by and large a district, that typically suffers from multiple power outages that can last as long as 14 hours. And very, very few households can actually afford an air conditioner. And this is one of the settlements in which we are working. And one of the things that I don't have time to talk about today when we talk about adaptation is migration as adaptation. So just very, very quickly as a footnote, Jacobabad is part of a region in Sindh, which also includes the cities of Larkana, that have always been hot. And these are regions that became habitable because colonial officers came and inhabited them. So Jacobabad is actually named after Sir Jacob, who was a senior colonial officer. And so the heat conditions in this region have always been hot. But what is interesting is that the humidity levels in Jacobabad are actually rising. And this is also largely because of agricultural interventions. And this is kind of a thing across South Asia. So, but then it also differs in terms of other parts of this slice at the northern tip of Sindh, where cities like Larkana do not have the humidity factor, but they are dry heat. So this whole notion of local climates and how local climates actually interact with global warming has very, very interesting and very differentiated impacts as we go from city to city, or even within cities themselves, because of the biosocial and the infrastructural dynamics. And one of the interesting things in this community, this was a low-income community, and these are typically Pashtun-speaking, for those who might be familiar with what Pashtun in Pakistan and across Afghanistan. These are Pashtun-speaking migrants who have been settled in Jacobabad for well over 2 decades. And because it gets super hot indoors, the young lady that we were interviewing, she was explaining to us that when it gets hot, they don't sleep indoors. So they make these beds, and these beds are made. This is not straw. This is some kind of a local plant that they use to convert it into like a bed, and they put it on bricks, and then they put water. They water it at night, and it gets wet, and not completely wet, but somewhat moist, and it cools down. And the entire family then huddles together and sleeps on this bed, and then they put a mosquito net over it. So those two poles at the opposite end are meant for the mosquito net. And that's how they sleep through certain portions of the summer. And then the rest of the portion of the summer, they migrate to a city called Quetta, which is slightly up north, and that's towards Balochistan, where the temperature is supposedly slightly cooler in comparison to what they experience in Jacobabad. So the migration trajectories are something that we're also hoping to track once we have a better understanding of how to sort of set up our trust networks within this community. So that's just a little sliver of what coping is about. So let me move on very quickly then to integrating the biological, social, and infrastructural pathways into this broader discussion. So in 2024, a group of my colleagues and I came together for a pilot project that was actually funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Our research began with a deceptively simple question. how do mobility, heat stress, and undernutrition interact, especially for displaced women in South Asia and in Africa, taking the case of Pakistan, and urban Nigeria. We adopted what could be called a syndemic lens, because the clustering of these conditions is not random. Female internally displaced populations experience these risks together due to socially structured mobility, inadequate shelter and fragile water infrastructures, limited access to health services, gendered labor roles involving water collection, caregiving and food preparation, chronic food insecurity, and nutritional scarcity. And we were interested in focusing on displaced women because we were looking at this whole issue of migration mobility from a standpoint of not just climate-induced mobility, but different kinds of triggers, because climate-induced mobility, if you just take it as a given, is a bit of a red herring. People move for a wide variety of reasons, and in the regions that we were focused on, it's also usually due to violence and not just climate change-related impacts. So heat stress and undernutrition, we argued, are not parallel health conditions. They reinforce each other biologically. Undernutrition weakens the body's ability to cope with heat. Heat stress increases nutritional demands while suppressing appetite. Dehydration compromises thermoregulation and digestion. Gastrointestinal illnesses from unsafe water worsens nutrient absorption. And this is why female IDPs, or internally displaced populations in extreme heat environments, become a crucial population for understanding how climate hazards interact with embodied vulnerability. And I know that on day one of our symposium, we were talking about how hard it is to look at populations who are not stationary, such as the homeless, to try and understand the impacts of extreme heat on them. And here you have, an equally complex situation looking at female internally displaced populations that move to large urban centers, secondary cities. They might settle in low-income settlements or informal settlements, but also very hard to access, also their mobility comprising differentiated dynamics of socioeconomic complexity. And what became particularly crucial for us was water as a central pathway to understanding the syndemic factor. So in the pilot project, we were mapping different kinds of pathways across communities and disciplines. One pathway that emerged as pivotal, and this was based on conversations with different kinds of stakeholders, both in Nigeria and Pakistan, and working with humanitarian agencies, with academics, with activists, etc. And we learned that inadequate access to potable water or lack of safe water becomes a very important syndemic pathway because it reduces hydration, it weakens sweat efficiency, and increases susceptibility to kidney injury. In addition to that, it compromises breast milk volume and nutrient quality. This came out in our conversations with nutritionists. It heightens infection risk and intensifies heat strain. So water becomes not only an infrastructural issue, but a biological amplifier of heat health inequities. So in urban Pakistan's low-income settlements, where water arrives intermittently, is often purchased and must be fetched by women, heat risk is transported through the body via dehydration and through the household via constrained capacities to store, to cool, or to treat water. So very briefly, let me move on to lessons from Jacobabad, what it means in thinking about living at the threshold of heat adaptation. So coming back to Jacobabad, in our ongoing work, Jacobabad provides an empirical window into what life looks like in a place approaching heat's physiological limits, the outer limits of adaptation. And there are three foundational insights emerging from this. And these are the three different sites that we are working in Jacobabad, in district Jacobabad. So one is the Noor Muhammad Pathan village, which where I showed you the photographs of our conversations with that young lady sitting in the courtyard, and that bed, which is in a sort of a rural urban part on the outskirts of Jacobabad. Then Jat Mahalla, which is a somewhat, I would say, slightly middle class neighborhood, more located in the center of the city, a very old neighborhood, and Sumrabot, which is slightly also on the periphery, but has different kinds of permutations. And the infrastructural realities across these different neighborhoods within the same city and the intersectionality dimensions also are highly differentiated. So three foundational insights that are emerging. One, that heat is spatially uneven even within the same city. So what we're going to be doing very soon is installing indoor heat measuring devices to understand the complexities of in-home temperatures that are often significantly higher than official weather station data. So there's lots of weather station data coming out on Jacobabad from the Pakistan Meteorological Department, but really there is no intervention on the indoor overheating dimension. So, and we want to do this because we are aware of the fact that in Jacobabad, especially in places like Nur Muhammad Pathan village and in Sumrahov, dwellings are not built with heat-absorbing materials. And this is sort of a fairly pervasive situation across informal settlements and low-income settlements across the global urban south. Ventilation is often inadequate, and water access is also very often inadequate, if not unavailable entirely. So this means that government advisories based on outdoor thresholds systematically underestimate true exposure, especially for women, infants, the elderly, and the homebound. Two, behavioral adaptation has its limits. Communities do adjust their behavior through changing activity timing, reducing metabolic heat production, increasing rest periods, but these coping strategies might hit a ceiling when living routines are non-negotiable, such as childcare, cooking over open flames, water collection, informal sector labor. So these are some of the issues that we're keeping in mind. And in this context, then, adaptation is not straightforward. Adaptation becomes a question of power. Who has the ability to reorganize their day and who does not? And thirdly, we must understand not only biophysical limits, but also social ones. So from Jacobabad, we are learning that thresholds are not universal. Poorer households may be reaching uncompensable conditions earlier. Women, due to indoor confinement, might be reaching them in different ways than men. And infants generally might be crossing them faster due to immature thermoregulation. So this compels us to think about differentiated adaptation, not universal adaptation. So these insights are mirrored almost exactly in African cities. And if I might refer again to the IID report that will be coming out very soon. In Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, homes in informal settlements stayed hotter than ambient conditions for over 70% of a 24-hour cycle, with humidity levels exceeding 70% at night, drastically reducing the body's ability to cool through sweating. So this convergence of evidence across continents and across cities underscores a critical policy point. The frontier of heat adaptation may very well lie inside people's homes. This is debatable, but I kind of feel that way, not outside. And governments must recalibrate heat health strategies accordingly. Moreover, women's bodies are literally absorbing the associated structural inequalities. So moving on to part 4 of my keynote, gender mobility and embodied heat, insights from displacement contexts. So female internally displaced persons in Pakistan and Nigeria inhabit a landscape saturated with heat stress, food insecurity, and mobility constraints. And you might ask, well, why focus on internally displaced populations? I could call them migrants, involuntary migration. There are different ways of classifying it, but these are bodies and people who are constantly on the move in these regions. And these movements have been ongoing for centuries, but as of late, many of these movements have also been triggered by wars, by violence, internal conflict that dovetail with climate change-related impacts. So they are not simply vulnerable groups, they are central actors whose daily labor sustains households despite extreme conditions. So we developed a conceptual framework for our Mobility, Heat, and Nutrition project. And let me highlight several of the biosocial dynamics that came out of it. First of all, we argue that mobility shapes exposure. So mobility for displaced women is often limited by social norms, controlled by security regimes, and restricted by caretaking responsibilities. And if you want to see security regimes, come down to Jacobabad. I'll show you what happens when military intelligence officers start following you around and telling you that you're not allowed to work in those communities for XYZ reasons. Also had a lot to do with the political economy question that I was talking about on day 1 of the symposium. So in April, when India and Pakistan went to war, Jacobabad has an Air Force base, and there were drones exploding over that region. I was there at the time. And then when I went back into the field 3 weeks ago with colleagues, we just couldn't get in because now it's the 27th Amendment. The Chief of Staff has powers that are bigger than God and military agencies everywhere. So we were told point blank that we want to install weather stations, you want to install this, do that, you want to talk to communities. Come back later once you've gotten all the favors and all the clearances. So the security regime aspect is very, very real to South Asia, and it manifests in very peculiar, in very unexpected ways that has to do with deep political economic history. So there's a heat of a different kind that one experiences in this particular part of Sindh. And then women, displaced women, also often restricted by caretaking responsibilities. So this results, we argue, in longer time spent in poorly ventilated shelters where heat builds cumulatively. So I'm not just talking about heat waves, I'm talking about the chronic heat, right, that never dissipates, it kind of stays there longer and longer. Second, water collection is gendered heat labor. Fetching water requires travel during peak heat, carrying heavy loads, queuing in unshaded spaces. This generates metabolic heat, raising personal heat load and dehydration risk. Three, nutritional reserves are gendered, as I'm learning from my colleagues who are nutrition experts. This has been like a steep learning curve for me, working outside the confines of my discipline. Women often eat last or least, moderate their own intake to prioritize children, experience micronutrient deficiencies. Thus, they begin each heat season with reduced capacity to cope. And fourth, breastfeeding is also a heat-affected metabolic demand. I have no idea. I have only learned this in the last few months. Heat stress influences milk volume, fatty acid composition, immunoglobulin content, and feeding frequency. Don't ask me any questions as an expert on this, but this is what I'm learning, right? So my learning curve is steep. So these changes have cascading consequences for infant nutrition, a dimension that is largely absent from climate health assessments, yet central to long-term human development. So in thinking about this biosocial syndemic lens, this symposium seeks not only to describe crises, but to advance conceptual approaches. So let me offer three contributions emerging from the interdisciplinary work that I'm involved in with colleagues at IIT, with colleagues who are part of my Mobility Heat Stress project, and from the work that I'm doing on Jacobabad. One, heat health cannot be understood without social infrastructure analysis. Extreme heat is not solely a meteorological hazard. It is co-produced by housing quality, water systems, energy reliability, labor regimes, urban planning. When does the city become, a source or a force of violence because of this whole issue of temperatures and gender mobility? So this shifts our analytical focus from individual vulnerability to infrastructural vulnerability. The data on African cities vis-a-vis IID's work strengthens this argument. Corrugated iron roofs, lack of ceilings, minimal cross-ventilation, and overcrowding were key drivers of dangerously high indoor temperatures, with some Kenyan and Zimbabwean homes reaching 40 to 45 Celsius indoors, even when outdoor temperatures were lower. Such evidence confirms that ambient vulnerability is a built environment phenomenon. Heat is amplified or mitigated by housing typologies and infrastructural neglect. Two, we must expand climate risk frameworks to include nutrition and hydration pathways. Climate risk assessments rarely integrate the biological dynamics of undernutrition and hydration. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And almost never through a gendered or life course lens. Yet these interactions fundamentally determine heat tolerance. Thirdly, adaptation has outer limits, and they are socially differentiated. Jacobabad's heat frontier, for instance, reveals that adaptation is not infinite. Communities may temporarily push the envelope, but without cooling, without safe water, without nutrition, without dignified shelter, the physiological limits narrow rapidly. Adaptation is therefore not just a technical challenge, it is a question of justice, of care, and political investment. And I know there's tons and tons that's been written on care, and one can theorize about it and conceptualize about it, but that's a word that I do care about, right? But it's a different kind. It's about an ethics of care, and how do we think about an ethics of care? So policy and practice, how might we move towards an integrated cross-sectoral heat health strategy? So I think first of all, we need to move beyond sectoral silos. This is just incredible. I mean, this is what at least I've learned in the last decade or so that I've been working with colleagues from different disciplines on extreme heat and compounding extreme events. Because heat health impacts cascade across wash, nutrition, shelter, maternal and child health, and labor policies. Yet these sectors typically operate separately. Our research must be aimed to also help governments and NGOs ask trans-sectoral questions such as, how would improved water access reduce workplace stress in infant undernutrition? How does ventilation improvement amplify gains in hydration and breast milk quality? How do social practices amplify or hinder biomedical interventions? And a critical blind spot in national and municipal heat action plans, and I take this as a cue from what's happening in Pakistan, is the absence of indoor heat metrics, which I've already talked about a little bit. So as heat health governance. Secondly, to prioritize potable water access as a heat health intervention. Safe water is a thermoregulatory resource. This is something that is, I think, really undervalued. It is a nutritional determinant. It is a maternal and infant health protection. It is a climate resilience tool. And this is where water must be recast from a wash concern to a core adaptation strategy. Thirdly, investing in women's cooling, hydration, and nutrition infrastructure. And examples include community water points with shade and cooling, heat-resilient shelters designed with women's routines in mind, mobile hydration and nutrition support during heat waves, and policies that can reduce gendered heat labor, as well as early warning systems calibrated to indoor thresholds. And finally, supporting transdisciplinary learning systems. So in the work that I'm doing with colleagues on these different projects, our work emphasizes that solving climate nutrition mobility problems, for instance, requires a shared language, collaborative decision-making, regular feedback loops, participatory evaluation, and generally a transdisciplinary learning system that can create institutional environments in which cross-sectoral practice becomes possible, not exceptional. So finally, Africa and South Asia as a living laboratory of climate urbanism. And I want to highlight here very quickly a project that I'm involved in. So both urban South Asia and Africa exemplify the confluence of heat extremes, water scarcity, energy security, informal urbanization, gendered labor, displacement mobility. And yet these are also sites of profound ingenuity, right? From Karachi to Larkana to Khairpur, Jacobabad, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam. There are micro adaptations happening in architecture, community-led cooling strategies, informal early warning systems, women adjusting feeding patterns to sustain their infants, and youth-led water distribution initiatives. This is something that I'm learning as a part of this Heat Nexus project. And these innovations show that adaptation is not passive endurance. It is active, it is creative, it is situated resilience. And as much as I don't like that word resilience, nevertheless, but resilience cannot replace rights, nor can it substitute for structural investment. So Heat Nexus is a global research network that is addressing the health impacts of extreme heat through locally grounded, scalable adaptation interventions. This is a 5-year strategy that includes commitments to 4 main themes over here. Let's see those 4 main themes over here. And what makes these projects, it's 9 projects situated mostly in Africa and Asia, but also going towards Southeast Asia and Latin America. And these are localized projects. Researchers and project leads are from and based in the countries where the research is taking place. These projects are engaging policymakers and practitioners. We're focusing on capacity enhancement and exchange for building skills, exchanging expertise, and there's a lot of research synthesis happening also across these projects. And the Heat Nexus approach is to engage policymakers and practitioners, and also for what is essentially capacity enhancement and exchange. And if you're interested to know more about it, you can sort of later on, if you like, I can give you access to these links. And the Heat Nexus project is also available on LinkedIn. And there are really, really some fantastic findings coming out of all these projects together. I'm on the advisory board. There are four of us on the advisory board, so we meet very frequently, and I'm having an opportunity to attend all the seminars in terms of the incredibly interesting data that is emerging and interventions on ground. I was just part of a conference at the Al Khan University in Karachi, where the lead of the project for Shapes in Karachi could produce some absolutely fantastic data, especially interventions-related projects on introducing cooling tools in low-income communities, and which are really having a positive impact. So if I may move on now towards closing, and so extreme heat is not an event, essentially. Oops, sorry, let me just, never mind. It is becoming a chronic condition. Its impacts are not evenly distributed. They are differentiated by gender, by class, by mobility and access to infrastructures. Its thresholds are not fixed. They're shaped by nutrition, by hydration, and most of all by social contexts. And its solutions are not contained within any single discipline. They require transdisciplinary biosocial thinking and cross-sectoral action. The communities of Jacobabad at the outer limits of adaptation, the lives of female internally displaced populations across South Asia and Africa, and the infants whose bodies register the earliest effects of heat, they are signaling the future. They reveal what happens when climate change collides with inequality, and they remind us that a heat future will depend on recognizing the interdependence of biological and social worlds. So the alignment between findings from Jacobabad and those from Mathare, Kombo, Kariba are striking. Across South Asia and Africa, the hottest environments are not the open streets, but the interior spaces where women, infants, elderly people, and home-based workers spend most of their lives. If we fail to address indoor overheating as a core policy priority, we will continue to underestimate risk and misallocate resources. As we confront the next decade of rising temperatures, let us resist simplistic narratives of heat resilience and instead pursue structural transformations: safe water for all, dignified shelter, gender-responsive policy, integrated modeling and decision-making tools, and the political recognition of the limits to adaptation. Universities, such as this wonderful, wonderful university that I have been invited to be a part of today, city governments, and global health practitioners here today can play a pivotal role in mainstreaming indoor heat metrics, redesigning climate health curricula, and championing gender-responsive adaptation. Heat may be universal, but its harms are not inevitable. The knowledge we generate together, from physiology to anthropology, from climate science to nutrition, from community voices to policymaking, can help redesign futures in which people not only endure heat, but live well despite it. I also want to acknowledge the role of young researchers and students, the role they will play in building the next generation of climate health evidence and advocacy. Finally, I would like to underscore that heat reveals the fault lines of our societies, but it also reveals our capacity to respond collectively if we choose to redesign our infrastructures, our policies, and our priorities, with care lying at the heart or at the center. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nausheen. Thank you so much for that very critical lens, bringing an intersectional perspective into all of these conversations, and reminded of all of the conversations around how disasters are not natural, and Jesse Bott's paper on vulnerability doesn't fall from the sky, and for walking through a very, very different case. And since I have the microphone and you didn't have enough time to spend on that, could you tell us a little bit around sort of what's happening, framing migration as adaptation, and sort of how useful is that, what's happening in that space conceptually, because it's a fairly new, maybe 4 years-ish within sort of that space. And I think we're seeing different patterns across South Asia, particularly in that space.
Yeah. So, I mean, so if we just focus on heat and South Asia, right? So there's a deep colonial history of voluntary migration going up to the mountains, right? All the rich colonial officers and their lovely, cooling stations up north and in India, and also wealthy native populations used to do the same, right? So that seasonal migration, you could call it that, was always a part of South Asia's history. So one of the things, and of course, the British geographers have done brilliant work on this, right? And I could name a few, but I'm forgetting their names at the present time. There's amazing work out there by British geographers who've looked at this particular phenomenon. In the present context, when Tom and I decided that we would select Jacobabad as a site, I had no idea that migration, these seasonal migrations, were actually part of the broader story of how people cope in cities like Jacobabad. And I've been visiting Jacobabad on and off for the last 3 years. And because it has a very, very different, heat and humidity context to Karachi, where I have worked for a very long time now, and also worked on extreme heat. And the heat in Jacobabad is very palpable. It is very different. You can get dehydrated very, very fast. And it's very easy to get knocked out if you don't take along the right amount of rejuvenation salts and those sorts of things. So we're at that point right now. We're just kind of embedding ourselves in that one community that has apparently done this seasonal migration story for decades. And in our anecdotal, and the anecdotal evidence is showing that that communities across this particular spectrum across this region have been moving around for centuries when it comes to extreme heat, because this is a region that has always been hot. And the difference now, of course, is that we are looking at these crazy limits, right? These outer limits for that adaptation. When it's 51, 52 Celsius, well, what does that mean if you have very limited or no access to water, when your shelter simply cannot adapt to that kind of heat? And even that picture that I showed you with the bed outside, even that has its limits. And they said that, well, this works. This strategy for us works around up until about March. And then come around April, it starts to get so hot that even sleeping outside on that bed is impossible. And we have to move. So what does it mean when whole communities, families move together and they go to Quetta, which they said is cooler? And I have no idea what that means. I've been to Quetta. And in summer, Quetta is not necessarily cooler, right? But there's something about this context of local climates that for them makes Quetta cooler. But maybe it also has to do with social networks. And it also has to do with the deep history of migration, in which livelihood systems also and wages, etc., become part and parcel of that broader practice of, well, migration just might be a little better in that season because we can have a better lived wage out there. This is a conversation that you and I were having, right, on the day one of the symposium, that in those summer months when the heat is so excessive, irrespective of whether the heat wave comes or not, there's a chronic heat condition, that actually earning a living wage might just not be possible. So maybe going to Quetta is that coping strategy where setting up a tent there that is part of your social network simply makes it possible to earn a lived wage, right? So it may very well have to do with that, but we don't know yet. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it answers a lot and it opens up lots of questions. There's a very interesting, I was recently at the International Sociological Association Forum, and there's an interesting sort of parallel to what you were saying about heat. A PhD student was following women in the mountain communities in the Himalayas, and exactly about how women anticipate the floods. So you sort of ration your food and how you sort of prepare for the floods, and exactly the same thing what you're presenting in a heat context. And I think very exciting. I have a lot of questions, but I think let's maybe take a few from the audience as well. Let's maybe start with sort of this early warning system that you were talking about. Early heat warning systems require strong communication, infrastructure, and education. What challenges do you see in implementing these in places like Jacobabad?
Yeah. So there is an early heat warning system that the Pakistan Meteorological Department puts out. And it goes all the way down to the provincial. Sorry, I mean, we had those floods earlier this year. And those floods, if anything, they show that this entire early warning detection system has been a complete failure. It's not actually a failure. There's a much deeper story behind it. So for heat, the PMD sets out an early warning system, and the early warning system actually does work. And this was put in place after the 2015 heat wave, and in which in Karachi alone around 1,200 people died. This was recorded in the newspapers, although it is suggested that it was, the numbers of deaths were much higher than maybe they were around 6,000, 7,000, but we'll never know. It's not like the Paris heat wave where you had a proper mortuary where a public officer had been assigned to actually count numbers and take a look at, who was dying of what and those kinds of things. This doesn't happen in South Asia. So, so there is an early warning system and it does work, but the problematic, of course, is, and Karachi's early warning system, for instance, the heat management plan is a carbon copy of the Ahmedabad heat management, right? It's like literally a cut and paste job, and with a few tweaks here and there. And not that there is anything massively wrong with that, but one of the issues is that there is nothing about indoor overheating. And so we do have strong communication infrastructure, and a lot of the strong communication infrastructure in cities like Jacobabad actually lies at the level of NGOs interventions. So one of our interlocutor, our partners there, is a fantastic NGO called Community Knowledge Foundation, and they've been working on heat in Jacobabad and its surrounding regions for a very long time, and they get funded by international by entities, and the money is channeled into heat risk mitigation strategies, funding beds for hospitals, setting up cooling stations when just before heat waves hit, and generally throughout the summer season. So there are these kinds of interventions, but the problem is, it's that same problem that we see everywhere across the global urban south, that until Sarkar, or which is the state, doesn't intervene, these are largely band-aid approaches. Because with population, with the sort of the cities like Jacobabad, and also compounding extreme events, flooding is also impacting secondary cities in places like Pakistan. So when I visited Jacobabad in 2023 after the 2022 floods, its peripheral parts had expanded quite significantly because of the extreme flooding event that hit in 2022, where over 30 million people were displaced across Pakistan. And the hardest hit province was Sindh. You could see where these populations, where a significant number of populations had come and settled in secondary cities, not so much in big metropolitan centers like Karachi, right? And they were living in makeshift shelter. And then you had one flooding event ended, then another one came, then the extreme heat factor started. So you have expanding populations and expanding built environments. So NGOs and early warning systems, they are good. The indoor heating element is not addressed. And ultimately, it is the state's responsibility. The state has to intervene. It's the only entity that has the capacity to do so.
I think let's maybe stick on to that and take the next sort of in sort of what are some of them you highlighted a few, and maybe if we were to look at larger global south cities and sort of focus on what are some of the most overlooked dimensions in addition to some of the things that you discussed on heat and health at the moment. There's a lot of young people in the room, and I'm sure they're looking for sort of also sort of what are these blind spots within heat research?
I sort of discussed some of these blind spots already. I think the gender dimension is honestly a very big blind spot. And while it might seem like common sense for us as researchers and academics, but in practice, it is a huge blind spot. And certainly in the Pakistan case. So, and also the, again, I bring up the political economy question, and it sounds so boring, and I hate to sound so repetitive, but something as simple as the fact that adaptation interventions aren't going to work unless you have municipal capacities and strengthening at the local level. And so certainly in the Pakistan case, for instance, where we have very high level of centralization when it comes to governance systems, into India to some extent also, it's a mix, and this is like a colonial legacy, it's specific kinds of local economies. Talking about adaptation, bringing out the national adaptation plans looks fantastic on paper, but at the local level, it's not going to work unless you simultaneously strengthen and devolve power to a very large and allow resources to flow at that level. I know there are lots of complexities attached to that also, but in a very, very simple sense, that is also a huge blind spot. And in Pakistan, it's a blind spot which has then compounded the effects of the impacts of climate change, whether it has to do with extreme heat or with flooding. In flooding, you see it immediately; it's far more visceral. With extreme heat impacts, it's a little bit more stealth-like. And so, unless there's outreach at the local level, for instance, in terms of upgrading shelter, water systems, all of those sorts of things, adaptation, in my opinion, will remain just a part of a broader rhetoric, and a paper-based, sort of thing.
This is an interesting one. How willing are men in the families and communities to recognize the increasing or increased vulnerability of women and act on them? Are they willing to make changes?
It's a great question. Right? Well, I mean, I guess the question that I would ask to that is, yes and no. It's a very, I mean, I don't want to fall into the trap of making it all about misogyny and patriarchy and then walking out of this room and saying, as a South Asian feminist, it's all patriarchy and misogyny. I mean, the work that I see of NGOs like Community Knowledge Foundation, CDF on ground in Jacobabad, the manner in which they're intervening and the awareness that they are creating has a very strong gender component attached to it. So the awareness raising is also to enable men and women to understand about each other's differentiated vulnerabilities and the burden on women and the care work, helping to men to make them more aware of that. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's a very hard thing to do. So how does it, how does it actually pan out at the community and the household level? And can it work through certain kinds of interventions? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes the interventions can be preachy. There's a long history of solid scholarly work on within urban sociology and coming from the global south and the global north on what it means to intervene at the household level to create awareness about women's rights and entitlements, and that can become a very slippery slope. So I think it really depends on whether you are in a large metropolitan center, intersectionality, class issues, those kinds of things. It's not straightforward.
Thanks, Nausheen. Do you want to have a question?
Okay. So what do I believe are the current gaps in data that is available, especially in South Asia? So I presume this would be the data on extreme heat. I think on mortality. That's the thing. That's the big one. And I think as medical scientists and climate scientists sitting out there, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the mortality data.
That's right.
That is the.
We also don't see hospital admission data.
Yeah.
In the context of
that's right.
As well.
Yeah, and I know that in the last project that I was part of, my young team of researchers and I tried very hard just for Karachi to find the data on hospital admissions, and it was impossible to pin down. Just really, really impossible to pin down.
Thanks, Nausheen. There's another one on just adaptation, and you spoke about that a little bit. How do you go about challenges in acknowledging existing power structures and pushing for just adaptation when working with different stakeholders?
So, so that's a question that deals with issues of climate justice and thermal justice before. So I think in the context in which I work, so if I look at African cities and then I look at cities in South Asia, so similar dynamics at the local levels and also many, many differences. The issues of climate justice and social justice come together. And we've been talking about social justice in the context of cities for a very long time now, right? We can go back to David Harvey, go back to the last 40, 50 years of amazing work done on social justice in the city. And now how all of that dovetails with issues of climate justice. I think from my point of view, from my perspective, the single biggest challenge is urban planning, essentially. And so I am a city and regional planner. When I think of issues of social justice and climate justice, for me, the one primary tool, the one big political impediment is how we design and plan our cities and how we think about planning. And for me, design is like the devil in the detail. And if you switch your brain to design, then you kind of start seeing the world in a very, very different kind of ways. Where we sit, it's how we move, it's where we're allowed, which bench we're allowed, if you're a homeless person, are you allowed to sleep on that bench at night? In parts of California, they put spikes on the benches and you can't, right? Because the homeless are seen as the other, right? I mean, it's all of those kinds of questions. So what I see, and I don't want to get cynical about this, is that when it comes to urban planning and the uptake of social justice, climate justice issues into the heart of urban planning, which then would also put gender at the forefront, and the equitable arrangement of resources, transparency of budgets, how are budgets being spent, all of these questions become a part of it. how we're designing our cities, what does the future look like for risk mitigation, for adaptation, and it's not about building a seawall, right, and imagining that the water won't seep underneath, right, those kinds of things. I think for me, it really, really is all about urban planning, and and the challenge is that how do we fold social justice, climate justice issues into urban planning, and then make those tools and the implementation plans that come out of it work. So how do, you know, bureaucracies and colonial mindsets, how do we shift those? You know, we've decolonized, but you know, the mind is the last entity to decolonize. And certainly in the context in which I work, the colonial mindset is very difficult to shift. And and how do you ensure that climate justice is not anti-poor? And that question dovetails with issues of, well, how do you make sure urban planning is not anti-poor? And Pakistan has decades legacies of anti-poor urban planning. And I could just go on ad nauseum on these kinds of issues. So these are hard ones.
Absolutely. I think I'm just reminded of, I've been sort of thinking myself about how is disproportionality by design, right? So in some of the global south cities that we work in, and how this continues to sort of unfold itself and manifest itself in the context of extreme heat, weather, and disasters more broadly. I think on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much, Nausheen, for this very, very different take on presenting extreme heat, particularly in global south cities, and also bringing gender, urban planning, many of these sort of thematics into the conversation today. Thank you. We know you've been struggling with a really bad flu, but thank you so much.
Great questions.
Great questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.